Hey gang, what's good? Welcome to another Morrowind Mechanics video guide. This time, we're looking at the functionality of all the illusion spell effects. Hopefully, you'll be able to get more use out of this often tragically overlooked school of magic. We'll be going over things in roughly alphabetical order, but also grouping together similar effects where it makes sense. As always, feel free to refer to the timestamps I've written out in the description if you're looking for a specific effect. First on our list is blind. Being blinded essentially overrides the gamma and brightness of your in-game world. Higher magnitudes increase this effect, so at 100 you can't see anything at all. Menus like the minimap are still usable and can be a good workaround if needed. You can actually get around the visual effects of blind by raising the gamma and brightness of your monitor, but honestly it's hardly worth the trouble. Behind the scenes, blind effects also impact a few of the formulas used by the game. Blind affects both the sneak check formula, used to detect the player when sneaking, and the hit chance formula, used to determine whether attacks from ranged or melee weapons will land. That said, there's usually better options in combat compared to blind if you're looking to debuff that on an opponent. Usually when sneaking, chameleon effects are more practical, and we'll cover those in just a bit. When in combat, paralysis is often more practical than blind as well. However, in case you're being blinded yourself, maybe you're using the boots of blinding speed, it's important to recognize the impact the effect is having on your own stats. If you're playing an unmodded version of the game, blind effects are actually bugged, and will actually substantially buff your hit chance with weapons. However, if you're using a bug-fixing mod like the unofficial Morrowind code patch, then blind works properly and reduces your chance to hit. Moving on, let's cover both chameleon and invisibility. They work similarly in allowing your character to more easily sneak around undetected. Both effects add to the formula used to determine how sneaky your character is. Chameleon effects add whatever their magnitude is, and invisibility always adds 100. If you have multiple sources of chameleon, the effects are cumulative. The key difference is that invisibility's effects are cancelled whenever your character interacts with the world. Chameleon effects don't share this limitation and allow all interactions for their duration. The catch is that chameleon effects are usually just more costly, and it takes some work to reach that 100 magnitude, the equivalent of an invisibility effect. Because of how the formulae work, in theory, an NPC with high enough stats should be able to detect an invisible or 100 chameleon player. So I went out and tested this myself, using console commands to boost an NPC's stats. As you can see, an NPC with sufficient stats can detect you if you're using a cumulative 100 chameleon effect or an invisibility effect. That said, there are very, very few NPCs in the game with stats that high. You'd probably also need to have your own auxiliary stats debuffed, like agility and your sneak stat itself. Generally speaking, a 70 magnitude chameleon effect is totally sufficient. Next on the list is charm. This simply raises the disposition of an NPC by the effect's magnitude for its duration. Although higher magnitudes are difficult to cast early on, consider using a charm effect alongside a fortify personality effect. Keep in mind that time and durations are paused when you open dialogue, so you can easily keep charm durations very low, using just the bare minimum that you personally need. Next, let's go over light and night eye. Both of these effects help your character see in darkened areas. However, they do this in slightly different ways. Light essentially causes the affected person or creature to emit light as though they were a torch or lantern. Night Eye, on the other hand, essentially raises the brightness and gamma settings of your game. You can easily enter the game menus and increase your gamma for almost the same effect. Next up is paralyze. This is one of the most useful combat-related spells in the entire game, at least in my opinion. It does exactly what you'd expect for the most part. However, there's just a few important notes on how it works. First and foremost, while you can rely on paralyzed spells for most of the game, be warned that many enemies in the Blood Moon and Tribunal expansions are either immune or resistant to paralyze. Vampires in the base game are also completely immune. On the topic of resistances and immunity, it's worth noting that willpower does make a character more resistant to paralyze. Rarely is this ever a factor, but there are a handful of boss-tier encounters where this actually is relevant. Despite all of this, paralyze is still very much worth considering making use of, especially if you're a hand-to-hand combatant. When punching a paralyzed enemy, you no longer need to punch through their fatigue meter first. You'll immediately start to damage their health with each punch. Although hand-to-hand is still generally a poor choice when it comes to damage, this does help immensely. Finally, I guess it's worth pointing out that airborne and aquatic creatures will all fall or float when paralyzed. Cliff racers will plummet to the ground and slaughterfish will float to the water's surface. Now, let's take a look at Sanctuary. Very simply, it increases the odds that a character will completely evade an attack from a weapon. Sanctuary effects also stack together additively, like chameleon effects do. This, combined with its low base cost of just 1, makes Sanctuary perhaps the most powerful defensive effect in the entire game when it comes to fighting any character or creature who is not using spells. Let's now check out silence and sound effects. Sound effects? They both actually work quite similarly to invisibility and chameleon effects. If you're familiar with RPGs, then you probably already know that silence is going to prevent a character from casting spells for the effect's duration. Sound works kind of like that, but instead of outright stopping spellcasting altogether, it instead reduces the target's cast chance. The important detail here is that while under the effects of sound, the enemy in question may still attempt to cast spells, essentially wasting their magicka. The catch is that if the magnitude of your sound spell is too high and reduces your target's cast chance down to 0, then your target won't attempt to cast their spells at all. They'd treat it as if they were silenced. The idea is to use a magnitude that's high, but not too high. Personally, I'd recommend somewhere between 50 and 80 magnitudes. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary, especially against targets that are resistant or susceptible to magicka. And at the end of the day, none of these effects are actually the ideal way to reach this goal. Instead, if you're able to, opt for damage magicka or damage intelligence effects from the destruction school. They're typically more costly, but also more potent. Finally, I saved the more esoteric effects for last, that being calm, demoralize, frenzy, and rally. They're all sort of related, so I thought it would be easier to explain them by grouping them together. Before we move on, it's important that you're aware of a certain bug. Well, it's more of an oversight than a bug. You see, Demoralize Humanoid is actually classified as a mysticism spell. Obviously, though, if you're running the unofficial Morrowind code patch or something like that, you don't gotta worry about this. Among the many hidden values inherent to each NPC and creature in the game, there's the fight and flee AI tendencies. It's easiest to think of these two tendencies as a character's combat morale. The fight value dictates whether or not a character will enter combat with you, and flee dictates whether or not a character will try to run away or retreat from you if they do enter combat with you. On screen now is a range of fight values, and how characters will react depending on their fight value. The majority of regular passive NPCs you can speak to begin with both of these values, fight and flee, set to 30. This means that no matter how much they dislike you, you don't ever need to worry about them attacking. As the fight value increases from 30, they're more and more likely to engage in combat the lower your disposition is, and the closer you get to them. At 90 fight, NPCs will begin combat with you if you move too close to them, regardless of their disposition towards you. I tried to dig up similar ranges for the flee value and attempted some testing of my own, but honestly, I wasn't able to get very much that's concrete. In fact, throughout my testing, I found that a lot of the fight value details were either incorrect or incomplete, despite this table being relatively widespread. Neutral NPCs didn't enter combat until an 80 fight value with 0 disposition. So, shoot for around a 50-point magnitude effect alongside a 0 disposition, give or take depending on your target's resistances and vulnerabilities, of course. Mind you that Frenzy also isn't considered a hostile spell, so it can be a good replacement for taunting and speechcraft. You don't even need a long duration on the effect. Once an NPC is locked into combat with you, it's totally fine if the effect fades. Just make sure your target gets in the first hit. Anyway, going back to the flee values, here's what I was able to uncover on them. You see, flee has several factors similar to fight, and how it accounts for distance and disposition. One of the factors is health. As a character's health decreases during combat, they're going to become more likely to run away if their flee value is already high enough. Opponents are also likely to retreat if their flee value is once again high enough, and you're currently brandishing a melee weapon while your opponent has access to either a ranged weapon or a spell. Finally, there's several situations where opponents will always flee. Such situations include you suddenly disappearing, for example, if you used an invisibility effect, or you levitating into the air out of melee range. And if, well, the last one's kind of a spoiler. Look away now if you're wary of such things. I'll have it on screen now, visual only. Alright, we're out of spoiler territory now. Anyway, going back to flee, if you happen to know the exact specifics of how these flee factors are all used, please feel free to leave a comment. I absolutely welcome it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Before we move on, let me just say that if you're curious about what these values actually are as you're playing, you can check them yourself using the get fight and get flee console commands on the character in question. Okay, now going all the way back to the actual spell effects. They are used to alter both the fight and flee values, as you may have guessed. When it comes to the fight value, frenzy effects raise it and calm effects lower it. As for the flee value, rally effects raise it and demoralize effects lower it. Let me just say real quick, special thanks to Redditor Yosilamas for helping out with this next part. There's apparently a rather significant bug with these spell effects when used in conjunction with the speechcraft system. You see, these effects allow fight and flight values to be increased or decreased higher than 100 and lower than 0. This usually isn't a problem, but if while the spell effect is still active, you attempt persuasion on that same NPC, you'll bug out the relevant value. This seems to be because the speechcraft and persuasion system uses what's called clamped stats. Essentially, that means that the values within that system are locked between 0 and 100. It seems like they just don't mesh that well together. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be fixed at all with the Morrowind code patch. Now, if you've seen my speechcraft video, you may already recognize this footage here. This is actually the bug in action. In this situation, the opponent should actually be pacified completely rather than constantly fleeing. So the easiest way around all of this is just to limit the magnitudes of these 4 effects using the ranges we went over earlier. You'll want to avoid going overboard. mind you that some creatures and races are more resistant or susceptible to magicka, meaning things can get a little difficult, so just make sure you quick save ahead of time. I'll also have a link in the description to Yossi Llama's comments to me if you're interested. They put a lot of work into their comments, and I think it'd be a shame to just withhold that information. Phew, well, that ought to be it when it comes to the Illusion Spell School in Morrowind. Even if you decide to avoid Rally, Frenzy, all of that, absolutely consider making use of Illusion's other very powerful effects. They're simple enough to understand, and they'll get you pretty far. Now, if you're curious about making your own illusion spells, or doing combat using magicka, be sure to check out my other mechanics guides covering just that. There's tons of other details in there as well, and I'm still adding to it. I've also got a weekly playthrough going of Morrowind on maximum difficulty, if you're into that sort of thing. New ones are popping out every Monday. Now, if none of that interests you, thank you nonetheless for watching this one. Peace.